Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tabakoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to today's Iranian Study book launch featuring Dr. Parisa Vaziri's Racial Blackness and Indian Ocean Slavery, Iran's Cinematic Archive. We thank Dr. Vaziri for accepting our invitation and joining us today. I'm grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their extraordinary support of the Institute of Iranian Studies. At the outset, and before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to express our collective and individual gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto and the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. Dr. Parisa Vaziri is an assistant professor of comparative literature at Cornell University and a fellow at the Society of the Humanities. Her research and teaching interest explores the critiques of history, the subject, and the concept of human as articulated primarily by Black critical thought. At Cornell, Dr. Vaziri holds a joint appointment with Near Eastern Studies and teaches courses on race, critical theory, slavery, and film and media. In addition to her monograph, Racial Blackness and Indian Ocean Slavery, Iran's Cinematic Archive, she has published several stellar articles in journals like Philosophy Today and the Drama Review. Please join me to welcome Dr. Parisa Vaziri. Dr. Vaziri.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you this afternoon, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. So I think, yes, there we go. Yes, so thank you again, especially to Dr. Tabakoli Targhi for the invitation, to Sophie, Shabnam, and Bilal for helping to facilitate all the logistics for the book launch today. Because this is an Iranian studies series, I have had to think a little bit differently about what it means to give a talk about this book in this venue. I'm used to presenting for different kinds of audiences, and I think at a first glance at the book title should give you a sense that this work is addressed to a number of very different kinds of audiences. I understand this book primarily as a work of theory, and it's important for me to say that at the outset for two reasons. The first is that area studies, which is where I would kind of situate especially the more nationally circumscribed versions of Iranian studies, it tends to be rather anti-theory, apart, of course, from a few pioneer scholars like the director of this series. But I think my writing really moves against the area studies model, in particular, this kind of tendency toward information extraction and information accumulation. A lot of what I communicate about Indian Ocean slavery has to do with its resistance to becoming information. its resistance to becoming fact. And part of that resistance is embodied in the enigmas of transmission. The second way, so before I go much further, this is just an image of the cover of my book, but I wanted to point out that there is a promo code on the right-hand bottom of this screen, which you could use on the publisher's website, University of Minnesota Press, if you're interested, of course, in the book. So the second way that I understand this as a work of theory is that it's really unapologetic about being speculative and is intended primarily to generate thinking about the construction of facts rather than to simply yield or transmit facts that can or should be taken at face value. I do obviously frame the project with a certain level of concern for the empirical, and I will move into that world in a little bit. First, I'll broaden the frame as widely as possible to touch upon one of the more conceptually extravagant dimensions of the book. And that's the way in which I'm bringing together the three terms in the title: racial Blackness, Indian Ocean slavery, Iran cinematic archive. I'm bringing these terms together in essence through a kind of long, drawn-out analogy between the technological apparatus of cinema, the theory of slavery as a kind of ontological rupture in time and space, and the concept of racial Blackness as an ongoing disruption to and recontextualization of its own meaning. So I'm going to spend most of the presentation kind of breaking this formulation down to the extent possible. And I'll start by addressing the different terms and the three different terms in the title. It's the first two, racial Blackness and Indian Ocean slavery. We generally tend to know the term racial Blackness in its relationship to a history of dispossession of enslaved Africans in the Americas and evolving theories of race that serve to justify it. Some of you might be familiar with this book, Lyndon Barrett's posthumously published Racial Blackness and the Discontinuity of Western Modernity. I'm choosing this title somewhat arbitrarily because there really are so many good books that have been written or that make a very similar kind of argument that transatlantic slavery ushers in a discontinuity in history, wherein the rise of modern subjectivity becomes tied to the dispossession of Blackness. I'm choosing this title primarily because it's just very illustrative and explicit about this. I'm also starting this way because this sort of necessity of beginning with transatlantic slavery, as I'm doing right now, is a common way of introducing Indian Ocean slavery, because these two histories are often thought of in somewhat oppositional terms. And when I was just beginning to work on the dissertation version of this book, on some level, it was my own unfamiliarity with Indian Ocean slavery and my frustrations with the existing literature that motivated me to work on this project. The Indian Ocean is a very vast space, and I have to take a moment to clarify what I'm referring to by Indian Ocean slavery, because there are many different ways people use that term. Some use it to talk about the Dutch slave system, which drew captive labor primarily from the Indian subcontinent. Sorry, I have something popping up on my screen that I have to brush aside. Some people use this term, Indian Ocean slavery, to refer to the 18th century French slave trade from Africa to the islands east of Madagascar. Some use it to refer to Omani plantation labor on the east coast of Africa. in the 19th century. But the connotation that I'm primarily interested in is concerned with the slave trades from East Africa to the Persian Gulf, which existed in some, at least in some anecdotal form since antiquity, but that really became legible with the integration of the Persian Gulf into global markets in the 19th century. So, Indian Ocean slavery is often introduced through distinctions from transatlantic slavery. And one way to talk about those differences is through a distinction between agricultural or chattel slavery on the one hand and domestic slavery on the other hand. To call slavery non-productive and domestic has historically been the equivalent of calling it irrelevant. And the fact that Indian Ocean slavery is thought of as primarily a domestic form has led to an overwhelming consensus about its generally mild or benign character, which is an idea that's so common, it has a name. It's called the good treatment thesis. And then the second major distinction is the difference between racial and non-racial slavery. And then the logic of non-racial slavery is pretty basic. It's premised on two main observations. First, that no correlating concept of race can measure it with the concept of race that was developed and mobilized in modern Europe and the Americas existed in Indian Ocean societies prior to its colonial introduction. And second, the idea that Indian Ocean slavery was transracial, meaning that it was not only or even primarily comprised of African enslavement, but of the enslavement of diverse human population groups, most famously peoples from the Caucasus, for example. And there's also this idea that it hasn't left any kind of lasting legacy in popular consciousness, that there's a kind of resistance to its memory as well. And I push this, or I shift the language slightly to say that Indian Ocean slavery itself resists becoming history. So what happens when, suspending our expectation for facts, we pay attention instead to the resistance to facts, the resistance to becoming fact. So as you might be able to sense, I have a healthy suspicion about the way that our facts about Indian Ocean slavery have been constructed up until now. It might seem strange then to insist on this term racial Blackness when race too is after all a form of really an illicit form of factification, of reification. And my insistence on placing this term in the title of the book is an acknowledgement of the politicized dimensions of telling this history in the present. So the book is in conversation with the activism of Black collectives throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa, demanding that we reckon with the racial legacies of Indian Ocean and trans-Saharan slavery. And these groups, although they have accumulated a bit of support, especially in the digital sphere, still they're frequently ridiculed or silenced by way of the claim that Blackness does not exist or is incoherent in these contexts. But rather than deny this incoherence or interpret incoherence as pathological, I'm choosing to mobilize the alleged incoherence of racial Blackness positively. And in the conclusion of the book, I do engage a bit with the digital art of some of these collectives, including the Collective for Black Iranians. So racial Blackness is incoherent, non-existent, or out of context in the Western Indian Ocean. This is the allegation that I'm contending with. And it's primarily through talking about film that I'm able to activate the different potencies and contradictions of this concept, context. And I'll try to explain this a little bit more in just a minute. But for now, here are a few quotes that I hope foreshadow some of the resonances in these materials. So the making of films is in principle nothing but cutting and splicing, the chopping up of history before the lens. And this is the media theorist Friedrich Kittler from Gramophone Film Typewriter. Scattered scenes glued together with the special tape of cinema. This is Amir Rushan Kavusi in the film journal Ferdowsi in the 1950s. The slave is violently uprooted from his milieu. This is Orlando Patterson, Slavery and Social Death. And the revalorization of the sign of Blackness led to a psychic emancipatory explosion. This is Sylvia Wynter. So the cinema-specific argument that I make in the book is primarily about the stylistic strategies of two major filmmaking movements or tendencies in the mid-20th century. But before getting any more deeply into a discussion of genre, it's useful to kind of take a step back and contemplate more generally what cinema bodes as a global medium, a global event, and how it has participated and reflected upon a certain fragmentation of the world, a radical decontextualization of time and space, what Kittler calls the chopping up of history. In the 20th century, cinema starts to deplete the physical intimacy of traditional Persian storytelling modes like naqali that revolved around a master storyteller delivering performances of Persian epic to live audiences in intimate settings like coffee houses. And it's interesting, we were just talking about cinema and intimacy in the public sphere just a moment ago. This is an image of a naqali performance that's actually taken from a film, which is kind of exemplary because historically cinema does make obsolete more traditional forms of storytelling like naqali and wipes out the traditional role of the storyteller. So it's radically decontextualizing, replacing, one could even say destroying more familiar forms of cultural transmission. At the same time, cinematic images also purport to be straightforward representations of the real. So cinema does not just cut, it splices, as we saw in the Kittler quote. It dissociates and conjoins, but not always according to coherent logics. So I'd like to put emphasis on this tension or contradiction between cinema destroying the integrity of time and space, and yet seeming to reproduce a naturalized perception. And I see this tension playing out in the strategies pitting cinematic movements against one another. So two of the major filmmaking modes that I engage in the book are film Farsi and alternative filmmaking, which is usually captured by the heading in English, the Iranian New Wave, or Moj No, to condense a lot of material into a basic idea. I show how mid-century debates among Iranian film critics and filmmakers about the status of montage were not just aesthetic debates, they were political debates, and that filmmakers developed a language, a cinematic language that drew upon Blackness for its articulation. And in the meantime, it created and preserved artifacts of Indian Ocean slavery that could be considered both historical traces and simultaneously repressions of history. So I just mentioned two different contradictions related to cinema. First, fragmentation and conjunction, and second, repression and preservation. So the dominant mode of filmmaking in the 20th century, especially between the 1950s and 70s, was commercial filmmaking, and commercial films were known disparagingly as film farsi, a term that was coined by Qaboossi. And actually, thanks to being invited to present here, I discovered this pretty impressive site, Cinema Iranica, which is a collaboration between the University of Toronto and Encyclopedia Iranica that houses links to many pre-revolutionary films and other resources. So you'll see many more examples if you search for this site. Film farsis were often action-driven and characterized by very cliché plot themes that pitted tradition against modernity. And they were usually comprised of escapist melodramas and romance narratives, violence, and hypersexualization of women, as you can see in these posters. They also were characterized by this kind of aimless and chaotic editing strategies. And in particular, there was a debate over the status of montage in these films amongst more politicized filmmakers that understood themselves to be working against this trend. I'll play a very short clip of, it's actually a trailer of a film farsi, although I'm sure many people here are already familiar with this film genre, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about in terms of these chaotic editing strategies. Okay, so one of the chapters, really just one of the chapters in my book, is concerned primarily with film farsi. There are two major points I draw out about it. There are a series of contemporaneous complaints about film farsi that disparage its promotion of values associated with American consumerism and sex. But more than anything, the anxieties surrounding film farsi tend to be associated with anxieties about contamination with foreign influences. In particular, film farsi amalgamated elements from pre-revolutionary Egyptian films and Hindi language films, as well as American cinema. But I focus on something different. I focus on film farsi's adaptation of an indigenous form of improvisatory theater called siyah-bazi, or black play, that when translated to cinema becomes almost indistinguishable from blackface minstrelsy. And I'm going to play two different scenes of pre-revolutionary films that feature examples of this practice as a caveat for anyone in the audience who knows more than the average audience member about Iranian cinema. My association of these particular films with the commercial filmmaking mode is something that can be challenged. But again, it's important to sort of emphasize that I'm not very interested in the granularity of film taxonomy. That's not my primary concern. I'm mostly treating film Farsi as an idea rather than a strictly bounded category. So I think I'll have to stop my share screen for a moment to pull up YouTube. Okay. Hopefully this works. And if you have any trouble hearing, please, someone mention something in the chat.
برای قربان برای بله جناب غلامی چرب کردن این است به تازگی از بسته آورده اید آفرین آفرین اسمت چیست پسر امشه بنده قربان لیلا بله لیلا چه اسم مرد نمی شود آخه من مرد نیستم قربانیستم و گذاشتم لیلا همینجوری گذاشتم اسم پدرم قربان زهرا بله همینجوری بله خب که ما همینطوری اسم اون
واقعا که مسخره خوبه
بله بنده مسخره خوبی هستم یعنی اشتباه کرده ای پسر کمی فکر کن چی را اشتباه کردم دراج بیسمتی اشتباه صبر کنید قربان توهین نکنید قربان کردم اجازه بفرمایید بله میخوام خدمتتون عرض کنم که بله عرض کردم حضور دوسته قربانت کردم حضور سرکار که این آقای بله عرض کنم که اسم بنده لیلاست بله کنید قربان اشتبیانی
آفرین بسیار خوب بگویید نوازندگان ما رو سرگرم
نوازندگان سرگرم کنند یکی با اون صورت باشه این چیز باید کری بدم برمیگرده
قربون شما بچه شما قربون شما برای چطور خیلی متشکرم. چرا همه
Actually, I had meant to play that clip second. There's one more clip I wanted to play, but I actually don't know what I did with it. So that's okay. Have a limited amount of time anyway. So let me go back to, oh, I do know what I did with it. This was the first clip I was going to play, which is from another film by Farrokh Ghaffari, Shab Ghuzi, or Night of the Hunchback. Oops.
نه خوشمان نیامد اجازه بفرمایید این غلام خانه دست از درمتان بفرماید نوازندگان بنوازند
Okay, so there are two things to note about the speech of these characters. I think even with no familiarity of Persian, it's possible to intuit that the speech of the blackface protagonist is distorted both grammatically and tonally. And this distortion of Persian language is typical of the siyah of Siyah Bazi and seems to produce a kind of fantasy about blackened speech. That's also premised on a degendering of the figure. In the first scene, the siyah professes to having a female name, Layla, part of what's causing the uproar among his interlocutors, which could also be a possible reference to eunuchism. In both scenes, the characters take on the rhetorical posture of a slave who responds to a master figure. And although there's a lot more one could say about both of these scenes, I was mostly interested in the fact that they are scenes. That Siyah Bazi belongs to a tradition of itinerant improvisatory theater called Ruhozi, where musical troupes would travel from home to home as well as gather in public places to perform. So in the second scene, we watch the troupe has been hired to perform at a house party. And in the first, the performance is taking place on a city cafe stage. There's a kind of resonance between the original itinerancy of Siyah Bazi, then a material context instability in the medium of film, and in particular, the stylistic mode of film Farsi aesthetics, as well as a kind of conjuring of the radical decontextualization that defines the primal scene of enslavement, an ontological theft that's marked by the absurdity of the false, violently imposed name. I'm going to move on now to a very different kind of example, but just to recall again that I'm interested in following contradictions, and one of the main contradictions being this contradiction between cinema being both a preservation of as well as a repression of slavery's history. So I'm going to move on to the genre which opposed itself to commercial filmmaking, the much more internationally familiar Iranian New Wave. Again, what I'm saying about the history of cinema is that it can be really summarized, at least in the mid-20th century, it can be summarized as an antagonism between film Farsi and alternative or experimental filmmaking. The New Wave emerged out of a rebellion against film Farsi and was grounded in a desire for political orientation in the wake of the kinds of existential instabilities introduced by modernity, and more specifically top-down Pahlavi modernization. And one of the primary ways alternative filmmakers rebelled was through an explicit disdain for film Farsi's editing strategies. So if we can describe film Farsi as manic and haphazard, by contrast, New Wave films promoted techniques like the long take and continuity editing. To give you an idea of what I mean by this kind of emphasis on the long take, emphasis on continuity editing, I'll play now a short clip of Nasser Taqvai's Aramesh Dar Huzur Digaran, which was also considered to be one of the first films of the New Wave movement.
حالا چی؟ حالا کنیم الحمدلله خدا شکر.
So against the escapist vagaries of film Farsi, alternative filmmakers were above all interested in cinema as a kind of aesthetic tool for reorienting us to reality, which they understood as primarily political. And part of what I'm saying is that part of what I say in the book actually is that these stylistic strategies used to distinguish high cinema from low cinema were primarily borrowed from the genre of ethnographic documentary. And in fact, many alternative filmmakers were also amateur ethnographers, including Taqwai. And there's a chapter that's also a different version of which has been published independently. Some people might have seen that before, that discusses the co-development of the Iranian New Wave and ethnographic cinema. And specifically there, I'm looking at ethnographic films chronicling spirit rituals practiced by descendants of enslaved Africans in the Persian Gulf. And one of these rituals is called Zar. And Zar is a pretty important theme in the book. So before getting into what I think is getting into what I gain by thinking about its cinematic documentation, I'll just take a minute to discuss it independently as a phenomenon on its own. There's a general consensus, at least amongst anthropologists, that Zar is a kind of trace of Indian Ocean slavery, a kind of relic that has been passed down through generations of slave descendants. These different versions of Zar are practiced throughout Southwest Asia, as well as in North and East Africa. And there's a little bit of debate about this, but it's generally assumed that Zar moved through the Indian Ocean with the movement of slaves. So, for example, although they don't share any geographical border, there's a lot of similarities between the way Zar is practiced in Iran and the way it's practiced in East Africa. The basic framework of Zar is therapeutic, but it encompasses an entire cosmology that includes acceptance of spirit winds that can take over a person's body and spirit controlling their affect and behavior. And an elaborate ceremony is usually held to either divine the spirit's identity or to facilitate a therapeutic relationship between the spirit and the person that's been afflicted. None of the films I discuss in the book are actual representations of slavery. The only one that comes somewhat close to doing so is this ethnographic documentary about Zar. And there were a few different things that I noticed about it, specifically with regard to this broader argument about Iranian cinema. Because here again, in this documentary, Badejin, also made by Taqwai, in close proximity to the New Wave film that he's recognized for Aramesh Dar Huzur Digaran, there is again a preference for the long take and continuity filmmaking that comes to foreshadow the role of these techniques in the New Wave's attempts at political realism. So there's especially a kind of concern for capturing the Zar ceremony in its entirety. I'll just play a very brief clip of that, what I mean by continuity filming in the case of ethnographic documentary.
Could you share the sound too?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you can't hear the sound. I'm not sure how to do that because my sound is on.
Okay.
Parisa, when you share, did you click on the bottom? Can you stop your share, reshare when you open the share window, there's a small clicking like thingy on the bottom of your share window that says share sound. Click that and then it will share the sound automatically through Zoom platform.
Okay, sorry. So you didn't hear the sound on the other clips either?
We did, but it was coming through your mic, so it wasn't very clear. If you share the sound through the share window, like the first window that opens, you share, then it will share it through the platform and it will come very clearly.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Can you let me know if you're here?
Perfect now. Perfect.
So in this ritual of Zar, there is a moment of self-fragmentation, which culminates in a loss of consciousness. And in fact, this is the most important aspect of the ceremonial structure, a kind of entry into trance. And without this moment of trance, the ceremony isn't considered to be successful. So one can think about this as a kind of state of being occupied and emptied at the same time. Ethnographic studies of Zar shore up this sense that Zar participants describe their own experience as a kind of amnesia or loss of self. It's almost as if the telos of Zar consists not in the materialization of a symbolic register, but in its annihilation. And as I mentioned earlier, Zar is considered a trace of Indian Ocean slavery. So I wanted to think about it as a distinct register of historical memory. But what kind of a historical memory is this that culminates in a loss of consciousness? Don't we usually associate history with consciousness? But if from Zar, if from the practices transmitted by the enslaved, we could learn something about what a historicity of Indian Ocean slavery looks like, what we see is that this model conflicts with our expectations, an emphasis on surrender rather than discovery, on loss rather than recovery. And how do we contend with the idea of a loss that's not merely melancholic, but therapeutic, central to healing from history? How do we take seriously the practices that emerged from slavery as the basis to understanding its historicity, rather than beginning with a prior presumption of what history's form should and will look like? So this central and recurring loss is something that I follow at multiple levels of abstraction. The ceremonial drumming rhythm that culminates in trance, the rupture to context inherent to slavery, and the internal contradiction of facts. The fact that facts, to be what they are, need to be able to be repeated, and yet repetition, this process of transmission, inevitably leads facts astray, not accidentally, but structurally. So once again, I'm just finishing up now, to return to my engagement with the contemporary politics of the storytelling of Indian Ocean slavery. I ask how we can address the racial injuries of slavery without yielding to the blind accumulation of facts that drives contemporary knowledge production and consumption. And in response, I try to tell a story about the possibilities of a history that resists becoming fact. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vaziri, for your fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. And I encourage everyone to purchase the book and read it. And I'm certain that our colleagues have a number of questions. Could you entertain some questions?
Sure, of course.
All right, everyone, please let us know. Raise your digital hand and yes, Dr. Purzand.
Hi, Salam. Parisa Khanum, hi, Professor Tavakkoli and other attendees. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I have been engaged with the collective as well for some time, Ms. Parisa, and I would like to know how it has influenced your work. I've invited the founders always in my classes as guest speakers, etc. So I follow their work quite closely and have really appreciated their contribution to the discourses of the Iranian diaspora and also their links with communities inside Iran. So it would be very interesting to hear from you how they have influenced your conceptualization of the issues at hand.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I was already finishing up the first draft of this book when Priscilla, the founder of the Collective for Black Iranians, got in touch with me about some different projects that she was thinking about working on in the near future, including a documentary in Iran. And I was having conversations with her before the collective was founded. So I can't say that it had a very direct impact on the conceptualization of the book project, but I can say that it really encouraged me to finish because there was this really strong voice, not just one voice, but many voices wanting to see this work being done, wanting to see it out in the world. And prior to that, I had not really experienced much encouragement, at least not from an Iranian sphere. Mostly I was getting resistance, mostly I was getting a lot of confusion. And so I was very encouraged by the creation of the Collective for Black Iranians. And obviously I continue to be in conversation with them. But it does raise questions about the contemporary approach to telling the story of the history of Blackness in Iran. So obviously my approach really puts emphasis on questions about how we arrive at the facts that we arrive at. And I think the collective sort of is also grappling with the question of how to tell this story.
Yes.
And obviously they're engaging with different kinds of digital art, also documentary video. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Gita Banan, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Vaziri. It was a really fascinating talk. I was wondering if at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you're unapologetic about speculation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I'm mostly familiar with Black studies in the context of transatlantic slavery, and So with speculation, it's hard not to think of Saidiya Hartman, for example, but I'm wondering what that looks like in your work and in the context of your work. Thank you.
I think just methodologically, there's something speculative about the way that I'm writing about this history. My approach is not to kind of show you a number of facts about Indian Ocean slavery and then come to a conclusion based on the accumulation of facts that I've discovered, but rather to engage with the question of what it means for a fact to be a fact. So, for example, the point that I ended with, this idea of repetition, the repetition of facts, the fact that part of what it means for facts to function as facts depends on their capacity to be repeated over time. But then if we think about how repetition works, and I'm thinking about repetition, especially within the framework of, for example, the practice of zar, which is like a kind of transmission almost without a specific content, right? In the sense that it's not a kind of, it's not a straightforward trace of slavery. It's not a straightforward historical trace in the sense that what's being transmitted is a narrative about slavery, but it's still a practice that's connected to the dissemination of slaves. So I'm sort of engaged with thinking more conceptually about how facts are constructed rather than what I think would be the more expected approach to someone working on the history of slavery, which would be to kind of present facts as they've been either discovered or inherited. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Next question from Dr. Purtavov, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Parisa. Yeah, I'm curious about kind of your selection of the traces of slavery that you're kind of following. So I see a big difference between, and I think you do too, I think you mentioned this, the film Farsi representation or alternative cinema representation in the documentary. So one of them has a trace that is more embodied in African and descendants of African, and one of them is representation, often driving from ministerial practice and derogatory. So they're very different kinds of traces. I think you mentioned this yourself, and I'm wondering what you think of, or if you do or don't, and why you do or don't incorporate some of the early history of photography in this kind of argument, because that's where we see the earliest images, and those images have elements of self-representation as well as an external viewer camera. So there's a kind of more complex representation and trace. So I wonder why you didn't engage with the large body of, or maybe you do and it's just not in this presentation, or at least what the relationship you see between that body of photography and then the early cinema.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, and I'd love to know more about the specific photographs that you're referring to. I think there is something really specific about this kind of manic montage aesthetic of pre-revolutionary cinema that I'm engaging with, that is in conversation with a larger argument I'm making about the context instability of Blackness in the Indian Ocean. So for example, in the Siyahbazi scenes that I showed, I'm trying to make a point that there's a resonance between the sort of like haphazard editing strategies of the pre-revolutionary films in which Siyahbazi appears, but then also the kind of original context instability of this Siyah figure in Siyahbazi. And as we all know, there's this whole like convoluted narrative about the origins of Siah-Bazi. There's this inherited kind of collective inheritance of a mythologization of Siah-Bazi that's been collectively bought into, which I also find really fascinating because that sort of mythologization of Siah-Bazi that kind of traces it, and I'm referring to, you know, the speculations of the nationalist linguist Mir-Djalali, who tried to draw a connection between Siah-Bazi and ancient Sumerian rituals of mourning, women kind of blackening their faces in mourning. And the fact that there's a collective tendency to defend the practice of Siah-Bazi in the name of its cultural particularity through recourse to a kind of moral authority that's associated with history, with historiography, and the kind of context specificity that historiography is wedded to. This defense happens through recourse to that moral authority, and yet this whole genealogy of Siah-Bazi is completely ahistorical. It's completely speculative. It's rooted in myth. So I'm interested in the resonance between this kind of medium-specific form of decontextualization present in film, and in particular film Farsi or pre-revolutionary film, and then the context instability of this Siah figure and the various kinds of narratives that he is enmeshed in. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Vaziri. Manek Behujwala, please. Please go ahead, unmute.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there's any connection between the Tsar ceremony, you know, they go into a trance type thing, and the whirling dervishes, you know, that are practiced in Turkey, right? You know, Rumi and all those people. And whether this thing is coming from Africa, that's why the black, you know, character there, or is it really something else, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you can draw connections between different forms of Sufi practice and spirit rituals like Tsar. Tsar is, of course, not the only spirit ritual that's connected to the history of Indian Ocean slavery, and that's part of what allows me to broaden out my argument and talk about the globality of Indian Ocean and trans-Saharan slavery, because there are very similar parallel rituals in North Africa. In Morocco, there's Gnawa. In Tunisia, there's Stambeli. And they're each rooted in a similar kind of cosmology of wind spirits, and are sort of based in a ritual that's centered around divining the identity of the afflicting spirit. And the ceremonies include incantations and drumming. Of course, there are variations, not only in these different spirit rituals as they take place in North Africa and Southwest Asia and East Africa, but even within a particular region, there's differences among how these rituals are practiced within any given community. They vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. So there certainly are probably influences and elements drawn from different Sufi practices, but it's still generally considered to be the consensus that this is a practice that was disseminated throughout Southwest Asia and North Africa with the movement of slaves from East Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhujwala, for the really great question. Our next question comes from Dr. Omidyar Faridi. Dr. Faridi, please.
Yeah, thank you so very much for the wonderful presentation, and I really look forward to reading the book, Parisa. I was recently contacted by a journal who wanted a review of the book, of your book from me. So I really look forward to reading the book. I think my question is more about the technical aspect of the way that you approach and you discuss, film and film medium, and specifically about the questions of continuity editing. Of course, I was going here and there, and I was driving, so I may have missed, part of your description. But from what I collected from your discussion, the questions of continuity editing, it seems that in your discussion is closely tied to the kind of ethnographic documentaries that were produced in the 1950s and 60s, especially. And it seems that you also saw the alternative medium of cinema in Iran emerging in the late 50s and 60s as something that was also closely tied to the techniques of continuity editing. And I was wondering if you are also looking at a very different branch of, if I can, it's not probably a branch, but a very different trend of alternative filmmaking, also in the 1960s, also ethnographic, that in fact, they moved away from techniques of continuity editing, and there are all sorts of, jump cuts and, and experimentation with montage. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, maybe some of those, approaches to the language and to this, to the grammar of filmmaking in the 1960s. Specifically, my own research is on editing and montage in the 1960s, but focusing on Feridun Rahnema and some other filmmakers. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about those, and also the fact that, much of the film farces, the way that we know them, they heavily relied on techniques of also continuity editing, although with many, mistakes or errors, technical problems, but nonetheless, they also relied heavily on continuity for the sake of the narrative.
Would you mind specifying which branch or movement of ethnographic documentary you're referring to?
I mean, it is basically, the same group of filmmakers. Many of these ethnographic, films were being produced with the support of Iranian radio and television. But some of the films that were coming out, specifically the person who made now it's just like Pelican, was it I forgot his name right now, but a few works of Feridun Rahnema himself, not necessarily ethnographic, but he was the person who influenced also Nasser Taqvai and others, supported their projects. Now the names of the filmmakers are escaping. Just if you give me a second, I'll remember that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I understand your question, and it's a really good question. I think in order to emphasize this idea of there being a kind of antagonism between commercial filmmaking and alternative filmmaking, I really focus on this particular kind of distinction in editing strategies, but you're completely right that you can find counter examples in alternative cinema, in the new wave, in ethnographic documentary, where you would find precisely those strategies that are being denigrated by these filmmakers, like these haphazard kind of montage strategies, jump cuts. I don't really focus on that. And part of that just has to do with the way that you kind of pattern information or pattern materials in order to make a new argument. You know, that's why, so going back to the first question about how this is a speculative argument, you know, I'm not making a kind of taxonomic argument about, I'm not trying to sort of bind myself to a history of film taxonomy. Like, that's not the kind of project that this is, obviously. But I focus on this antagonism, and I do think it is an important antagonism. It is one way in which more politicized filmmakers, first of all, denigrated commercial cinema through a kind of disparaging of their editing strategies, but also tried to define their difference, even though you can find examples of various kinds of montage in alternative cinema. And ultimately, I end up saying that the distinction breaks down, like even in this, the example that I showed, where there's this attempt at continuity filmmaking in order to capture the entirety of the Tsar ceremony, there's this kind of contradiction going on, because you can't actually capture the object of Tsar. You can't actually capture what it is that's happening in Tsar. You see the kind of physical manifestation, but even there, with the clip that we saw, you know, there's a sheet covering the individual who's been afflicted, and the function of that sheet is literally to deflect the gaze. So there's a way in which Tsar itself, this particular ritual, really resists the ethnographic strategy of continuity filmmaking, and the attempt to do it just completely breaks down. But thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions? No.
Muhammad, I had
Yes.
a question, Nahid.
Yes, Naijan, بفرمایید.
I'm
Please.
sorry. I pressed down that hand, but it didn't like me. I thank you for your talk. It was fascinating. I'm particularly interested in your good treatment thesis. I think that's a really great way of putting it. Most Iranians, I'd say, especially from the older generation, denied they had slaves. I mean, to quote somebody who told me, we didn't have slaves, we had domestic workers and we loved them, they were part of the family. So there is this denial that has carried on to the formal channels of the Islamic Republic as well, because in the introductions to some of the books on slavery, they say, ما بردگی نداشتیم، ما بندگی داشتیم. So we had servitude, not slavery. So I wondered if what you think about this, as Bita Baghurizadeh calls it, the erasure of this experience of slavery that we had in Iran. Also, my other point is there's another Black figure, Haji Firuz, which comes with lots of theories about how he came to be Haji Firuz, but I see it as a vestige of 19th century or slavery. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Thank you, Nahid. Erasure. So yeah, I agree with this idea of erasure, but I think my book project is doing and saying something different. It's kind of asking where our expectation that there be a presence of a historical consciousness of slavery comes from. Like, why do we expect that consciousness ought to be there? And so rather than kind of beginning with the premise that first there is the consciousness of history and then it's actively suppressed or erased, I'm trying to think about something internal to the history or something internal to the past that itself is resisting becoming history, in the sense that we understand history as a kind of accumulation of facts. So it's complex, because then there are different forms of erasure we're dealing with, or the word that I like to use is resistance, different models of resistance. There's the kind of collective resistance to the memory of slavery that you're referring to, with this idea of the good treatment thesis, the idea that we didn't really have slaves, or if we did, they weren't really slaves, they were more like family. And then on the other hand, this kind of internal resistance inside of that history to becoming conscious of itself. And the example that, or one of the examples I'm using to think about that is ZAR, which is a practice that, a kind of embodied practice that comes out of slavery itself. And how do we think about that as its own kind of register of historical memory that doesn't operate at the level of facts? That's a different kind of transmission that's being passed down. It's not really, it's not quite history. What is it, and what can we learn from it when we think about ways to respond to this other kind of resistance that we also don't want? You know, we don't want there to be this active erasure of a history that was there. We want to address the racial injuries of history, for example. So thank you for your question. And I agree with your thesis on Haji Firuz. Obviously, I was referring earlier to these kinds of speculations about siyahbazi, in which it's rooted in ancient rituals. And of course, Haji Firuz is just one particular iteration of siyahbazi. So we're dealing with these same kinds of mythologies. And it's really worth continuing to ask about the power of the mythologization of these practices, why they have such a strong hold on the collective consciousness.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pirinazar, for your great question. We have three hands. Ustad Lewison, Professor Rekab Talai, and Dr. Abdi Zahiri. Dr. Lewison, please.
It's a sort of follow-up on the earlier question relating to Sufism. The Mevlevi is a Turkish Sufism, and I'm more asking about Iranian Sufism, so the Qadri and the Elahé, which do have this very much going into trance, and the Bihodi to have some kind of divine union. But I'm wondering if this Zar, which outwardly looks similar to the type of trance that the Qadris and the Elahé might come into, does it have anything, any kind of liturgy or ritual like the Qadri and Elahé, where they have a whole very intricate system of initiation and Pir Muradi and liturgy that they use, and the whole aim of it is a kind of bihodi to unite with the divine? Is there anything of that level? Does it root back to, for instance, voodoo or other indigenous African spiritual traditions?
Thank you for your question. There's sort of an issue with a lot of the ethnographic information that we have about Zar, and of course, that is my access to material about Zar, is through the ethnographies that have been written about it. And part of the issue is that this is a kind of ritual that's very much shrouded in secrecy. unlike other kinds of spirit rituals that are also connected to the history of slavery, but that are more public versions. So Zar is a very kind of secret ritual, and actually it was really by a chance that Nasser Tagway had the, was able to film this ceremony. He had personal contexts in Bandar Longue that enabled him to film the ceremony. Otherwise, it really would have been unthinkable for somebody to film this. So, and there's kind of a secrecy surrounding Zar, but also a secrecy within it. And part of that's connected to the kinds of incantations that are sung during the ceremony. They're sung in languages that people who participate in this ceremony don't necessarily know. They don't necessarily know the words. And for a while, it seemed that this might be because the incantations were in African languages that people had forgotten over time, and that's why they no longer understood the lyrics. But then if you look at ethnographies of parallel kinds of Zar rituals in East Africa, for example, you find the same sort of secrecy surrounding the incantation. So they're literally sung in an unintelligible language, or in a language that even the people who are singing don't know. So yeah, I'm sorry, did you say something?
No.
Okay. Yeah, so which also makes it really challenging to say precisely what kind of a trace is this? What is the trace referring to? We usually assume that a historical trace has a referent, but in fact, it seems that Zar doesn't really have a very intelligible referent. We don't quite know what's being transmitted through it. And the ceremony is not really intended to create a union to the divine per se, the divine in general. It's really intended to facilitate a therapeutic relationship with the specific spirit that has afflicted the person who's there to be healed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is from Professor Rekab Talai.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vaziri, for your presentation, which I really enjoyed. I really like this idea of archival cinema, or cinema or film as an archive to trace, specifically here, of course, the legacy of Indian Ocean slavery. The question I have is basically a follow-up question to some of the questions that were already asked. I'm interested to know if you also trace the portrayal of Blackness, or especially like embodied Blackness, in film Farsis that actually cast Black actors, specifically those ones that were filmed in southern parts of Iran. And if you do in your book, I'm interested to know how you analyze that, considering your theoretical framework, and if that allows one to kind of reread, some of the, to reread some of the analyses that, have been persisting for so long in regard to the legacy of Indian Ocean slavery.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I really just spent one chapter talking about film Farsi, which didn't give me a lot of space to address the kinds of films that you're referring to, where you have Black actors being cast in the films. My focus was really on films that assimilated Siyafazi. But as I was kind of going through these films, I did notice a lot of instances where Black actors were cast as extras. And as you know, because of the really core quality, which many of these pre-revolutionary films have been preserved, it's really hard to kind of, sometimes you can barely see the characters, right? You're like, who is this? What's going on here? So I did encounter this kind of figure of the Black extra, even in the film from I showed the clip from Ahvari's Shab Ghuzi. There's a clip toward the end of, not the end of the film, but after this blackface performance, where there's a Black extra in the family home, where the Siyahbazi troupe has performed. And one thing that a question it raised at the level of analysis that you're asking about is really the question of what is this Siyah actually referencing? Like, what is the Blackness of the Siyah? And obviously it's not an authentic kind of Blackness. It's not even an authentic, you couldn't even say it's an authentic representation of an African slave, right? It's obviously not that. So I think the juxtaposition of these characters, Black actors who are cast in film Farsis, especially with examples of films where you have Siyahbazi happening in the same film, it really sort of highlights this question, this enigma about the drive of blackface. And this is a global phenomenon, right? Like, what drives this? What makes this such a universally comedic kind of practice? But thank you very much for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And the final question comes from Dr. Zahiri.
Actually, this is a follow-up to what Nahid Mozaffari mentioned with regard to the fact that we kind of tend in our national consciousness to kind of deny that there is this notion of slavery or blackness kind of is a part of our history. We kind of sort of tend to deny it. And I just remembered back in 1987, there was an article that at the time I was in Mashhad University, published in the United States by an Iranian academic, Minu Southgate, in the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. And she beautifully and academically proved the fact that even though Iranians kind of claim not to be racist, but I mean, and she referenced even the Gulistan Saadis, the cases of that slavery existed in Islam, and the State of Islam, they had slaves themselves, and then she continued down the line, and she made references in our literature and all the way. And I just wanted to mention that article if it's of interest to anybody, Minu Southgate. And also, if I could add this up, that even though we claim not to be racist, but if you look at our proverbs and sayings, some of the proverbs are kind of is a telltale of our, like when we say بالاتر از سیاهی زنگی نیست تیغ در کف زنگی مست دادن. And I can't think of any other proverbial expressions that are how much racist we are, and we kind of deny it. That's it. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for, I think this was more of a comment than a question. I appreciate the comment.
Yes.
I agree. I think maybe one of the things that's more provocative about my insistence on this term racial blackness in the title of my book is that, especially in the context of the kind of scholarship on race we have in Iranian studies, there's really this strong emphasis on the history of Aryanism, right? The way that the Indo-European thesis became assimilated into nationalist discourse in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that's important. It's really important to think about the ways in which Iranian nationalism in the 20th century was part of a global project, a project of global whiteness. But because of that emphasis, there's really been a lot of attention paid to the Indo-European Aryan/Semitic difference, the kind of exceptionalization of Iran as this Indo-European place in the middle of the Middle East. And so I think that there's kind of been really a lack of interest or attention to thinking about what that means in relationship to Blackness. If you're thinking about a country that has kind of signed on to this project of global whiteness, Aryanism, so how do you think about Blackness in the context of, in this context? So thank you for raising, also for mentioning Minir Southgate's article, which I know.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vaziri, for your fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I'm particularly really impressed with your theoretical orientation beyond nationalist and area studies. Great job, and we look forward to seeing you in Toronto in person in the near future.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who participated and who is still here. And thank you for all of your wonderful and generative questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tabakuli.
Thank you.